Most people picture Thomas as the weak disciple, permanently branded by a single moment of doubt. The truth is something else entirely. The man who demanded to press his fingers into the wounds was the one who traveled farther than any of his companions, crossed seas that few dared attempt, and died run through by a spear in a land far from home. This is the story they never told you about the disciple who doubted the resurrection. Thomas was not exactly a name, it was a description. In Aramaic, the language he spoke on the dusty roads of Galilee, the word teoma means twin. The Greeks translated it as Didymus, and the meaning remained identical. For nearly 2,000 years, no one could say with any certainty who the other twin was, and the ancient records never filled that gap. The man most remembered for doubting carried within his own name a riddle that was never solved. Consider what it actually meant to leave everything behind and follow an itinerant teacher through Roman-occupied Judea in the 1st century. Thomas was part of a group of 12 ordinary men, fishermen, tax collectors, laborers with no power and no land, who walked away from their families and their trades for a preacher from Galilee. And this is where two details need to be held in mind, because they will change everything you think you know about this man. The first is that Thomas's doubt was not the beginning of his story, it was the lowest point of a journey that began with brutal courage. The second is that his final destination was bound to a king whose very existence the whole world denied for centuries, until pieces of metal buried in the earth proved the skeptics wrong. Hold on to those two threads. They come back. Think about what it means for a man to decide he is willing to die for his teacher before anyone has even asked him to. In the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verse 16, there is the moment when Jesus announces he is returning to Judea, a region where only days earlier people had tried to stone him. The other disciples hesitate. The fear was rational, concrete, physical. Going back meant walking again toward men who wanted the entire group dead. And it is precisely at that moment that Thomas opens his mouth. He tells the others they should all go so they can die with him. That is the first real image of Thomas in the scriptures. It is not the image of a coward. It is the image of a man prepared to march into his own death out of loyalty. The very disciple history would later brand as the doubter was the only one who in that moment said out loud what all of them knew, that following this man could mean dying with him. The courage came before the doubt. It always does. Consider the kind of mind that needed to understand things in a direct, practical way with no room for vagueness. Thomas could not settle for the abstract. In the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verse 5, during the Last Supper, Jesus speaks about going to prepare a place and says the disciples know the way. 11 men stay silent, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of fear of seeming ignorant. Thomas does not. He replies that they do not know where Jesus is going and therefore cannot possibly know the way. It was that blunt, almost stubborn question that prompted one of the most quoted lines in the entire history of Christianity. Jesus declaring that he himself was the way, the truth, and the life. Notice the pattern already forming. Behind the label of doubter was a man who needed concreteness. He did not pretend to understand. He demanded clarity, and that demand, far from being a flaw, drew out answers that were etched into history forever. Now consider what happened to that group of 12 men in the hours that followed. The teacher was arrested in the night, tried in haste, flogged, and nailed to a Roman cross outside the walls of Jerusalem. The method of execution was the most brutal the empire knew, designed to produce an agony that could stretch over hours, sometimes more than an entire day. The hands and feet were pierced. The side was run through by a soldier's spear. 5 wounds marked that body, and those 5 wounds would reappear in the story of Thomas in a way that no one could have anticipated. When the teacher died, the group collapsed from within. The man on whom they had staked their entire lives lay in a tomb, sealed by a stone. The dream of a kingdom had ended on a blood-stained piece of wood, and the disciples, who days before had spoken of dying together, now hid behind locked doors, terrified of being next. Fear. This is the point at which the most famous scene of Thomas's life takes place, and the details matter far more than you might expect. In the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 24 through 29, it is recorded that when Jesus appeared for the first time to the gathered disciples, Thomas was not there. Where he was, the text does not say. And that absence is the key to everything. While the other 10 locked themselves together in the same room, sharing their terror as a group, Thomas carried his grief alone, outside that space. He had not fled from faith. He simply was not present at the precise moment it returned to the others. When his companions tell him they have seen the teacher alive, Thomas does not believe them. And his response reveals once again the same concrete mind as always. He declares that unless he sees the nail marks in Jesus' hands, puts his own finger where the nails were, and places his hand into the wounded side, he will not believe under any circumstances. Notice the precision of the demand. Thomas does not ask for a vision. He does not ask for a generic sign. He asks to touch exactly the 5 wounds of the crucifixion. He wants physical proof of the suffering, not the comfort of a ghost. And then time passes. Not minutes, not hours. The text records a specific interval, 8 days. Sit with the weight of that number. For 8 full days, Thomas lived surrounded by 10 men convinced they had witnessed the impossible, while he remained the only one who could not bring himself to believe. 8 days of meals where everyone spoke of something he had not witnessed. 8 days of prayers that sounded hollow to him. 8 days of being the outsider within his own group, the man who held the other's hope at arm's length because he had not touched it himself. That isolation was a quiet form of suffering that is almost never mentioned when this story is told. Thomas's doubt was not a single moment of arrogance. It was more than a week of loneliness inside a crowded room. After the 8 days, the disciples are gathered again, and this time Thomas is among them. The doors are still locked, and Jesus appears in their midst. What follows is the detail that transforms the entire scene. Jesus turns directly to Thomas and repeats, almost word for word, the exact demands Thomas had voiced days before, privately, somewhere else, in a room where Jesus had not been physically present. He offers his hands, he offers his side. He invites Thomas to touch. Consider what that implies. The conditions Thomas had laid out in a room Jesus was not in were returned to him one by one. The answer came in the precise measure of the doubt, and faced with that, Thomas touches nothing. He simply falls and speaks the most direct confession of divinity in all of Scripture, "My Lord and my God." Look at what just happened. The disciple who doubted most produced the highest declaration of faith in all 4 Gospels. No other apostle, in any other passage, addresses Jesus face to face with both words together, Lord and God. The man of concrete skepticism reached deeper than the companions who had believed quickly. The doubt did not keep him from the destination. It was the rough road that carried him there. And it is because of that scene that the entire story earned him the label of Thomas the Doubter. But what came afterward erases that label completely, and almost no one knows that second half. Consider the scale of what happened to those men after. The 12, now diminished and marked by the death of one of their own, were sent to carry the message beyond every known frontier. And here, the biblical account ends, giving way to historical records and the oldest traditions of the church. It is essential to separate one from the other. What is in the Gospels is the Thomas of doubt and confession. What comes now comes from later sources, the historian Eusebius of Caesarea, the Eastern Christians, and a 3rd century text known as the Acts of Thomas. These are documents that must be read carefully, separating the historical core from layers of legend. But even read with the strictest skepticism, they all point in the same astonishing direction. Thomas went far, farther than anyone. While most of the apostles spread through the Roman world, through the cities ringing the Mediterranean, the strongest tradition places Thomas on a route that borders on the unbelievable. He is said to have crossed the territory of the Parthians in ancient Persia and pressed on until he reached the Indian subcontinent. The straight-line distance between Jerusalem and the Indian coast exceeds 4,000 kilometers, and the actual route, bending around deserts, mountains, and seas, ran comfortably past 5,000 kilometers. Think about that in terms of what the first century had to offer. There were no paved roads linking the two worlds. There was no compass, no reliable map of that vastness. The journey was made partly overland, in caravans that endured the furnace heat of the Persian deserts, and partly by sea, on wooden vessels entirely at the mercy of the winds. To give you a sense of the scale, it is like crossing all of Europe from one end to the other, and then continuing for thousands of kilometers more. It was the equivalent of setting out from Lisbon and traveling by foot and by sail well beyond every horizon known to Europeans of that era. Follow the sea crossing carefully, because this is where the human cost became most brutal. The merchant ships making the run between Egypt and India departed from the Red Sea and cut across the open Indian Ocean. To do that, they depended on a phenomenon that Greek and Arab sailors had learned to exploit: the monsoons, the seasonal winds that blow in one direction for half the year and in the opposite direction for the other half. Anyone wanting to reach India had to leave within an exact window of a few weeks. Missing it meant being stranded for months or being hurled by storms onto reefs. The direct crossing of open ocean could take close to 40 days without sight of land. 40 days in a wooden hull packed with cargo, water rationed, food rotting in the damp heat, under a sun that hammered the deck. Think about what that does to a human body. The constant nausea of the swells, the dehydration, the wounds opened by salt water, the scurvy that attacked anyone who went weeks without fresh food, the fevers that swept through cramped spaces where dozens of people slept, pressed against one another. Many who boarded those routes never reached the other side. The floor of the Indian Ocean kept those who did not survive, and they made that crossing with no guarantee of ever coming back. Consider what it meant to arrive on the other side alive. Thomas would have stepped ashore in a land where no one spoke his language, where the gods, the customs, the food, and the laws were completely foreign. The tradition of the Christians of southern India, known as the St. Thomas Christians, holds to this day that he arrived on the Malabar coast in the region of Kerala around the year 52. There, according to this memory passed down through generations, he founded a series of Christian communities remembered as 7.5 churches scattered along the coast. They were small groups of converts in an enormous land hostile to the message he carried. But the most extraordinary part of this story involves a king, and this is where the second thread you held onto from the beginning finally comes back. The Acts of Thomas relate that before reaching the south, Thomas was brought to the north to serve a powerful monarch named Gondophares, described as king of a vast territory. For centuries, scholars treated this king as pure fiction, an invented name added to color the legend. There was not the faintest trace of evidence that a ruler by that name had ever existed. The skepticism was complete. The king was considered as imaginary as any character from a folk tale. And then the earth spoke. Throughout the 19th century, archaeologists and collectors began finding ancient coins in the northwest of the subcontinent, in the region that today covers parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The coins bore an engraved name, Gondophares, the name of an Indo-Parthian king who actually ruled in the 1st century, precisely during the period when Thomas would have traveled. A stone inscription confirmed his reign with a dating that fits the timeline of the tradition. The coins existed. The king existed. Notice the perfect irony of that discovery. The story of Thomas, the man who demanded physical proof before he would believe, contained for nearly 2,000 years a detail the world refused to accept for lack of evidence. And it was concrete objects, pieces of metal you could hold in your hand, that restored credibility to the account. The skeptic had needed to touch in order to believe. And posterity needed to touch buried coins to take his journey seriously. The pattern survived the centuries intact. Thomas, in a sense, had been right all along about the importance of evidence. Now examine the human cost of the mission itself, stripped of any romance about the adventure. A man alone or surrounded by very few companions, trying to persuade an entire people to abandon an ancient and deeply rooted religion. Indian society at that time was organized into rigid castes, and any message that treated all people as equal before a single god directly threatened the power structure of priests and nobles. Thomas did not arrive as a conqueror with an army behind him. He arrived as an unarmed stranger, speaking of a master executed on a cross on the other side of the world, asking people to abandon the gods of their ancestors. Each conversion created enemies. Each new follower was a direct affront to those who held religious authority. The psychological pressure of living that way, year after year, without family, without friends from his youth, without anyone who shared his memories of Galilee, is difficult to measure. The tradition records that he worked at this mission for nearly 20 years, from landfall to death. 20 years of isolation inside a culture that was not his own. 20 years knowing that any given day could be the last. 20 years, and the end came in the form you may already have felt coming. The most consistent tradition among the Christians of India places Thomas's death around the year 72 on a hill near Mylapore, today a neighborhood of the great city of Chennai in the southeast of the country. According to this memory, he was praying alone on a hillside when he was attacked. The instrument of death was not a sword, it was not a cross, it was a spear. Follow the circle as it closes. The man who had demanded to press his hand into the wound that a Roman spear had opened in his teacher's side died himself, run through by a spear on a distant hill, 5,000 kilometers from Jerusalem. The weapon he had needed to touch in order to believe became the weapon that ended his life. The 5 wounds he had insisted on examining found an echo in his own body. The disciple who had doubted the death and resurrection sealed his faith with the same kind of wound he once refused to accept without seeing. The hill where this is said to have happened is still remembered today as the Mount of St. Thomas, and across the centuries, places of devotion have been built upon it that receive visitors from every part of the world. The tradition also holds that part of his remains were later carried to the city of Edessa in ancient Mesopotamia, a movement of relics that the historian Eusebius mentions in his writings. But Thomas's true legacy is not kept in bones or in stone. It is kept in living people. Look at what happened to those small communities he is said to have founded on the Kerala coast. They did not vanish. They crossed the centuries. They survived empires, invasions, persecutions, attempts at erasure, and they are here today. The St. Thomas Christians, also known as the Nazranis, still constitute one of the oldest continuously existing Christian communities on earth, with several million faithful in southern India who trace their origin directly to that traveling apostle. To give you a sense of the scale, it is enough people to fill dozens of stadiums to capacity, all of them connected by an unbroken line of faith that stretches back to a single man who crossed the ocean nearly 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years later, they are still there. Consider what that truly means. When Thomas stepped ashore on that strange coast, alone, unable to understand the language, uncertain whether he would survive the next season, he had no way to imagine what he was planting. He did not see the 7 churches multiply into thousands. He did not hear the hymns that would be sung in his memory across 20 centuries. He did not know that buried coins would one day confirm his journey. He had not the slightest notion that the people he was trying to reach would carry his name for generations without end. He acted in the dark, unable to see the result, staking an entire life on a return he would never witness. And it is precisely here that the man branded as the doubter delivers his deepest lesson, a lesson that speaks to anyone, religious or not. The disciple who refused to believe without seeing ended up building the greatest work of his life in exactly the same way, without being able to see the outcome. He demanded proof before the wounds of his teacher, but offered 20 years of labor to a future he never looked upon with his own eyes. The entire story of Thomas is the crossing of a man who started from a demand to touch and arrived at total surrender to the unseen. The doubt was not the end of his story. It was only the place from which he set out to go farther than all the others. And what he left behind keeps breathing, speaking, and believing in a distant land, proof that the effects of a single life can outreach by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, everything that life could ever hope to see.